I'm Madison, a 32-year-old IT professional, and I've worked tirelessly to build the life I have today. But before I dive into the mess that became my life, let me explain a little about my family. I grew up in what looked like a typical middle-class household. My dad works in marketing, and my mom has always been a stay-at-home parent. From the outside, we seemed like a normal, happy family. But inside, things were far from perfect. The dynamic in my family revolved around one person, my younger sister Ava, who's 28 now. From the day she was born, she was my parents' golden child, and their favoritism towards her was impossible to ignore. I don't know if it was because she was the youngest or because she was a girl, but Ava could do no wrong in their eyes. Meanwhile, I had to earn everything. My parents weren't cruel to me, but I had to work hard for everything I got. If I wanted something, I had to prove I deserved it, whereas Ava simply asked, and it was handed to her on a silver platter. Growing up, it was always about Ava. If she wanted something, it was hers, no questions asked. But if I wanted something, even after working for it, I'd often be told I had to share it with her, or worse, I wouldn't get it at all. There was one instance when I had saved up for months to buy a new video game console, something I'd been dreaming about for weeks. The day I finally bought it, Ava threw a tantrum because she wanted it too. Instead of telling her no, my parents took it from me and told us we had to share it. But in reality, Ava got it whenever she wanted, and I was left waiting for scraps of time to play. This wasn't just about material things, though. It was about how my parents treated us differently in every aspect of life. Ava could manipulate them with ease, and they'd drop everything to cater to her every whim. If she wanted to go somewhere, they'd make it happen. If she didn't want to do something, they'd make excuses for her. Meanwhile, I was told to stop being selfish and that I should be more understanding because she was younger and more sensitive. I learned to stay out of the way. I focused on my studies, worked part-time jobs, and saved every penny I could. As soon as I was able, I moved out, got a decent job, bought myself a modest car, nothing flashy, but it was mine, and started building a life on my own. I thought I had finally escaped the toxicity of my family. Then, Ava got married at 24 to Thomas, a wealthy older man. My parents were ecstatic. They saw this marriage as Ava's golden ticket into high society. The wedding was extravagant, funded mostly by Thomas's family, and my parents couldn't have been prouder. They gushed over how perfect Ava's life was and how lucky she was to have landed such a generous husband. Meanwhile, my hard work at my job went completely unnoticed. Nothing I did seemed to matter to them, but Ava hadn't changed. She spent Thomas's money like it was going out of style. Designer clothes, jewelry, luxury vacations. It wasn't long before cracks started to show in her marriage. Thomas wasn't the type to put up with her excessive spending for long, and they began to argue. Ava would run to my parents crying, and they'd always take her side, blaming Thomas for not treating her the way she deserved. I could see where things were headed long before it happened. Their divorce was inevitable, and after 4 years of marriage, Ava was back living with my parents, completely broke. Because Ava had signed a prenuptial agreement, she didn't get a penny from the divorce. My parents were devastated, not just for her, but for themselves. They had pinned their hopes on Ava's marriage being their ticket to a better life, and now it was over. But instead of letting her face the consequences of her actions, they coddled her even more. They paid for everything, including expensive vacations to help her heal. It was infuriating to watch. Things took a turn for the worse a few months ago when I got a great opportunity at work. It was a short-term assignment that required me to travel frequently, and the pay was excellent. Since I wouldn't need my car while traveling, I decided to leave it at my parents' house. It was close to the airport, and I trusted they'd take care of it while I was gone. My car wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine, and it represented my independence, everything I had worked so hard to achieve. I thought I could trust my parents. I had no idea just how wrong I was. After 2 months of traveling, I returned home for a weekend visit, looking forward to relaxing and catching up. But as soon as I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed something was off. My car wasn't there. At first, I thought maybe they had parked it in the garage, so I went inside to ask. That's when my mom casually dropped a bombshell on me. We sold it, she said, like it was no big deal. I just stood there, stunned. You sold it? I asked, thinking this had to be some kind of sick joke. Yes, we needed the money, she said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What do you mean you needed the money? That was my car. You didn't even ask me. I was shaking with anger, trying to wrap my head around how they could have done something so outrageous. My mom didn't even flinch. Lily's been having such a hard time with the divorce, and we wanted to do something special for her. So, we sold the car and used the money to send her on a vacation to Europe. She needed it more than you did. That's when I snapped. All the years of being overlooked and taken for granted came flooding back in an instant. They had sold my car, the one I had worked so hard to buy, and all for Ava. Like my feelings didn't even matter. How could you do that? I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. That was my car. I worked for years to save up for it, and you just sold it like it was nothing. My dad, who had been silent until then, finally spoke up. It's just a car, Madison. You can always buy another one. But Ava needed this vacation. She's been through so much, and we wanted to help her. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So you think her needing a vacation is more important than my car? You think it's okay to just take something that belongs to me and sell it without asking? My mom sighed, clearly tired of my tantrum. You're overreacting. We did what we had to do for the family. Ava needed us, and we did what was necessary. You're doing well for yourself. You can afford another car. Their complete lack of remorse hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about the car. It was about years of being treated like I didn't matter. And now they had crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. As if things couldn't get worse, Ava walked in at that moment, fresh off her European vacation, looking completely unbothered by the whole situation. Oh, you're back, she said with a smile, ignoring the tension in the room. I turned to her, my anger boiling over. Did you know they sold my car to pay for your vacation? She didn't even blink. Yeah, they mentioned it. I thought you wouldn't mind. I couldn't believe her audacity. You thought I wouldn't mind? That was my car that I worked years to save up for. And you just took it without asking. Ava rolled her eyes like I was being unreasonable. It's just a car, Maddie. You can always buy another one. Besides, I really needed this vacation. It's the only thing that's made me feel better since the divorce. You should be happy for me. Happy for her? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just entitlement. It was pure narcissism. I could feel my blood pressure rising, and I knew I needed to leave before I said or did something I'd regret. So without another word, I turned and walked out of the house. But as I drove away, my mind was already racing with thoughts of how to make them pay for what they'd done. In the days that followed, the anger didn't fade. If anything, it grew. They had sold something that was mine without a second thought, all to indulge Ava's whims. And Ava? She didn't care at all. It was time for me to take a stand. This time, I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. I was done being the responsible one, the one who always sacrificed for the sake of the family. Now, it was time to put myself first. After the shock and betrayal from my parents selling my car, I couldn't just sit back and let them get away with it. This was no longer about the car. It was about years of feeling like I didn't matter, like I was just an afterthought compared to Ava. I was tired of playing the role of the responsible one while they pampered and coddled her. Something had to change, and for once, I was going to be the one calling the shots. The first step was to cut off any financial support. Over the years, I had helped my parents in more ways than I cared to count. I had lent them money, helped pay their bills, and even set up a joint emergency account for them, just in case. But after what they did, I wasn't going to fund their indulgence anymore. They didn't deserve my help. I withdrew all the money from the joint account and closed it. Then I canceled the credit card I had given them for essentials, which I now realized had probably been used to fund Ava's lifestyle. If they wanted to keep up their spending habits, they'd have to figure it out without my help. They had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to be their financial safety net any longer. But that wasn't all. I knew my parents relied on me for more than just money. I had been managing their finances for years, helping them with their taxes, setting up their online accounts, and basically running the financial side of their lives. Without me, they were clueless. So, I made the decision to sever that tie as well. They had a backup car that I had helped them purchase years ago. Guess what? The car was still in my name, so I sold it. I figured if they were so quick to sell my car, I could do the same with theirs. I wasn't going to let them benefit from my generosity anymore. The fallout was immediate. As soon as they realized what I had done, my phone exploded with calls and messages from both my parents and Ava. They were furious. My mom called me crying, saying I was being cruel and that they had only sold my car to help Ava through a tough time. My dad tried to reason with me, saying that family was more important than money and that I was overreacting. Ava, of course, accused me of ruining her life, as if my decision to stand up for myself was somehow an attack on her personally. But I ignored them. I was done being their doormat, and I wasn't going to let their guilt trips pull me back in. They had spent years treating me like I didn't matter, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. The situation with Ava was especially infuriating. She showed up at my apartment one afternoon, banging on my door and demanding that I fix everything. I opened the door and let her in, knowing this conversation was inevitable. She came in, pacing around like she owned the place, her voice full of entitlement and outrage. How could you do this? She spat. You sold the car and cut off mom and dad? Do you realize how much this is affecting me? You're ruining my life. I crossed my arms and stood firm. Ava, I'm not ruining your life. I'm just done letting you and mom and dad take advantage of me. You're going to have to start taking responsibility for your own actions. She didn't take it well. She screamed, called me selfish, accused me of being jealous of her, and even threw out a few choice insults. But I wasn't moved. The more she lashed out, the more I realized how right I was to cut ties with them. This wasn't just about the car or the money. This was about years of enabling her bad behavior and refusing to hold her accountable. I told her, calmly but firmly, that I wasn't going to support her or mom and dad anymore. If she wanted to continue living her lavish lifestyle, she'd have to do it without my help. She didn't know what to say, but her anger quickly turned into a tantrum. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her, but I didn't care. For once, I felt like I had control over my life. And that same day, I made the decision to go completely out of contact with my family. They had crossed too many lines, and I wasn't going to allow them back into my life unless they showed genuine remorse and changed their behavior. I knew that if I let them back in, nothing would change. Ava would still be the golden child, and I would still be the one they turned to whenever they needed something. I wasn't going to let that happen again. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary. For too long, I had been sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of the family, and I was done with that. I deserved better. At first it was hard. The calls and texts kept coming, and even though I ignored them, it was difficult to shut out the guilt. I knew that my parents were struggling without my financial help, and Ava was obviously furious with me. But I also knew that this was the only way to protect myself from further harm. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, but now I realized that I didn't need it. I was fine on my own. After a few weeks of silence, things started to change. My parents realized I wasn't going to come back to them, and Ava stopped trying to guilt trip me into fixing her problems. But the biggest shift came when I heard through the grapevine that my parents were finally feeling the consequences of their actions. Without my financial support, they were forced to downsize. They had to sell their house and move into a smaller, less expensive place. From what I heard, they weren't handling the transition well. My dad, who had always been so proud of his image, was embarrassed that they could no longer keep up with the lifestyle they had gotten used to. My mom was devastated, not just because of the financial strain, but because she couldn't pamper Ava the way she always had. As for Ava, she was floundering. She had never worked a day in her life, and without my parents' financial cushion, she was forced to find a job. From what I heard, it didn't go well. She bounced from one job to the next, never lasting more than a few weeks. Her entitled attitude and complete lack of work ethic made her a nightmare employee, and she quickly became known for being unreliable. The reality of life without endless handouts was starting to catch up with her, and she couldn't handle it. For the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. I had always been the one to make sacrifices, but now I was the one in control, and I wasn't going to let them back in. The more I heard about their struggles, the more I realized that cutting them off was the best decision I had ever made. I had spent years living in their shadow, always second to Ava. always trying to prove my worth. But now I didn't have to. I had built a life on my own terms, and I didn't need their approval to feel good about myself. Going no contact wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from their expectations, free from their manipulation, and free from the toxic dynamic that had ruled my life for so long. I didn't regret a thing. Once I cut my family off, I braced myself for the fallout. My parents had always relied on me to keep things afloat, and Ava had always expected me to pick up the pieces whenever her life fell apart. I knew they weren't going to just accept this new reality without a fight, but I also knew I couldn't back down. This was the first time in my life that I had truly stood up for myself, and I wasn't going to let their guilt trips drag me back into the toxic dynamic. At first it was tough. The silence was strange. For years, I'd been the one they turned to for help, whether it was financial, emotional, or just plain fixing their messes. Now, there was nothing. No more phone calls from my mom asking for money to cover one of Ava's emergencies. No more emails from my dad trying to smooth things over after they'd crossed another line. Part of me felt a sense of relief, but another part of me felt something I hadn't expected: guilt. I'd always been the responsible one, the problem solver. Even though I knew they didn't appreciate me the way they should have, it was hard to turn off that part of myself that felt obligated to fix things. But every time I started to feel guilty, I reminded myself of why I had done this. My parents had sold my car without asking me, just to fund Ava's vacation. That wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. And Ava, she didn't even care. She hadn't once apologized or acknowledged that what they had done was wrong. I stayed strong, and over time the guilt began to fade. The more distance I put between myself and them, the more I realized just how much their constant neediness had weighed me down. Without them in my life, I had so much more mental space, so much more time, and so much more energy to focus on things that actually mattered to me. My career, my friends, my own happiness. It felt good. But of course, my family wasn't going to let me go that easily. The first sign of trouble came a few weeks after I had cut them off. I started hearing from family, friends, and distant relatives, people who hadn't reached out to me in years. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough. They'd ask how I was doing and say they were thinking of me. But it didn't take long for the true purpose of their calls and texts to become clear. My parents had been sending them to talk to me, to try and convince me to forgive them and come back. "We so worried about your mom," one of my aunts said over the phone. "She's been so upset since you cut them off. She just wants to talk to you. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive them?" I bit my tongue. My aunt didn't know the full story, and I wasn't about to unload all of it on her. But I wasn't about to be guilt-tripped either. "I'm doing what I need to do for myself," I told her, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "This isn't about holding a grudge. It's about setting boundaries. She didn't like that answer, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into going back to the way things were. This wasn't about one incident. It was about a lifetime of being treated like I didn't matter. My parents had always put Ava first, no matter the cost to me. And now that I had finally said enough, they couldn't handle it. After a few more calls like that, I decided it was time to take more serious action. I filed a restraining order. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but it felt necessary. My parents were relentless in their attempts to get back into my life, and the emotional toll it was taking on me was too much. Even though they weren't showing up at my apartment yet, the constant barrage of messages through other people felt like harassment. I needed space, and I was going to get it one way or another. The restraining order was granted without much trouble, and once that was in place, the calls and texts stopped almost immediately. It felt like I could finally breathe again. But that didn't mean the drama was over. Through the family grapevine, I started hearing more about what was happening with my parents and Ava. Without my financial support, they were struggling more than I had expected. My dad had to take on a second job, and my mom, who had never worked a day in her life, was forced to face the reality of their situation. They could no longer afford to live the way they had before, and they had to downsize. They sold their house and moved into a much smaller place in a less expensive neighborhood. It wasn't the life they had been used to, and from what I heard, they weren't handling it well. Ava, meanwhile, was falling apart. Without my parents to bankroll her, she had no choice but to get a job. And that went about as well as you'd expect. She wasn't used to working. She wasn't used to being told what to do. She had never had to earn her way in life, and it showed. From what I heard, she went from job to job, never lasting more than a few weeks. She couldn't handle the reality of having to work for a living, and her entitled attitude didn't exactly make her popular with employers. Despite everything, though, I didn't feel sorry for them. They had spent years living beyond their means, counting on me to bail them out whenever things got tough. Now, they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. And as harsh as it might sound, it wasn't my responsibility to fix their problems anymore. They had made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. The real turning point for me came when Ava tried one last time to guilt-trip me into coming back. She sent me a long, emotional letter, through a family friend, of course, talking about how sorry she was, how she had realized the error of her ways, and how much she needed me in her life. But even in her apology, the entitlement was clear. She didn't really acknowledge what she had done wrong. Instead, she focused on how hard things had been for her, and how she was struggling now that I wasn't there to help her. She didn't mention the car. She didn't mention how she had treated me over the years. It was all about her, as usual. I didn't respond. I knew that engaging with her would just open the door to more manipulation. I had finally taken control of my life, and I wasn't about to give that up. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I had just moved on. The months after cutting them off were the most peaceful I had experienced in years. I no longer had to worry about being dragged into their drama. I no longer had to deal with the constant pressure of being the responsible one. I was free to focus on myself, my career, and my happiness. And for the first time, I realized just how much their constant neediness had been holding me back. The guilt I had once felt for cutting them off was gone. I knew I had done the right thing, not just for myself, but for them too. They needed to face the consequences of their actions, and they needed to learn that they couldn't always rely on me to fix their problems. I wasn't sure if my parents or Ava would ever truly change, but that wasn't my concern anymore. I had my own life to live, and I wasn't going to let them pull me back into their toxic web. I was free, and I wasn't going to give that up for anything. In the months that followed, I began to truly embrace the freedom that came from cutting my family off. It wasn't easy at first. Years of being the responsible one, the fixer, had left deep marks on me. But now that I was free from their constant demands, guilt trips, and manipulation, I started to feel lighter, as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time, I could focus on myself without worrying about Ava's problems or my parents' expectations. I poured myself into my work. My career had always been a source of pride, but now it became something more. It was my own life, built entirely on my terms. With the extra time and energy I had from no longer dealing with family drama, I was able to excel even further. I took on new projects, gained valuable experience, and built stronger relationships with my colleagues. For the first time, I was thriving without any distractions holding me back. Of course, there were moments when I doubted my decision. Cutting off family isn't something you do lightly, and even though I knew I'd done the right thing, there were times when I felt pangs of guilt. I'd catch myself wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I should have given them another chance. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of the years of mistreatment, the blatant favoritism, and the fact that they had sold my car without even asking. That wasn't something I could just forgive and forget. The longer I went without contact, the clearer things became. My parents and Ava hadn't reached out since Ava's last letter, but I knew that was only because the restraining order was in place. They couldn't reach me, and that silence, though strange at first, was exactly what I needed. Without their influence, I had space to figure out who I was outside of my role in the family. For the first time, I was living for myself. Eventually, word got back to me through distant relatives about how things were going for them. My parents were still struggling financially, trying to adjust to their new downsized life. They had sold their house, and from what I heard, the adjustment was difficult for them. They were no longer able to maintain the image they had spent years cultivating, and that was a bitter pill for them to swallow. I didn't feel sorry for them, though. They had relied on me for too long, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. As for Ava, things were just as chaotic as ever. She had lost yet another job, and from what I could gather, she hadn't learned anything from the situation. She was still blaming everyone else for her problems, still expecting someone to come in and rescue her. But this time, there was no one left to save her. My parents couldn't afford to support her the way they used to, and without me in the picture, Ava was finally starting to experience what it was like to stand on her own. It was a long overdue lesson, but one I doubted she'd ever truly learn. Despite everything, I didn't feel any satisfaction from their struggles. It wasn't about revenge or watching them fail. It was simply about moving on. I had no desire to see them suffer, but I also had no intention of letting them back into my life. They had shown me exactly who they were, and I had no reason to believe they would ever change. The truth is, cutting off my family was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but it was also the most empowering. For years, I had allowed them to take advantage of my kindness, to rely on me without ever offering anything in return. But now I had taken control of my own life. I had set boundaries, and for the first time, I was enforcing them. And that felt like freedom. There were moments when I thought about reconciliation. I'm not heartless. There were times when I missed the idea of having a family, of being connected to people who were supposed to love and support me. But then I'd remind myself that the family I missed never truly existed. My parents had always put Ava first and always treated me like the responsible one who could handle everything while they coddled her. And Ava? She had never seen me as anything more than someone to take advantage of. If reconciliation was ever going to happen, it would require more than just empty apologies. It would require real change, something I wasn't sure they were capable of. They would need to acknowledge the years of favoritism, the way they had treated me like I was less important than Ava, and take responsibility for their actions. And as for Ava, she would need to show that she had truly grown up and that she was capable of taking responsibility for her own life without expecting someone else to fix things for her. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. People like my parents and Ava don't change easily. They had spent too many years in their toxic patterns, too many years expecting me to pick up the pieces whenever things went wrong. And I wasn't willing to sacrifice my own happiness for the slim chance that they might someday change. So I kept moving forward. I threw myself into my work, traveled more, and reconnected with old friends. I started new hobbies, explored new passions, and found joy in the little things that I had once been too overwhelmed to appreciate. Without the constant drama of my family hanging over me, I felt lighter, freer, and more at peace than I ever had before. Looking back, I realized that my decision to cut them off wasn't just about the car or Ava's vacation. It was about reclaiming my life, about setting boundaries that should have been in place years ago. It was about finally saying I matter too, and refusing to be treated like a second-class member of my own family. In the end, I didn't need their approval or their validation. I had built a life I was proud of, and I had done it on my own. The weight of their expectations, their guilt trips, their constant need for me to fix their problems, it was gone, and I had no intention of ever letting it come back. So here I am, moving forward, living my life on my own terms. I'm no longer the responsible one who sacrifices everything for the family. I'm just Madison, a woman who knows her worth and isn't afraid to demand the respect she deserves, and that's enough for me.